This past weekend, Charles Dunn completed what many deemed to be an impossible task. He ascended Briar into living legend status, and not only that, he did it in a way that almost nobody would have expected. So today, let's break down the Fatigue Briar archetype. We'll talk about its strengths, its philosophy, and I will share with you the list that I personally have been working on for over a month now in preparation to take the exact same archetype into competitive play at the Calling Dallas-Fort Worth. Oops, guess I have to change now. So Fatigue Briar functions on a wholly different axis than normal Briar does. When you're looking at building Channel Mount Heroic Briar, you're looking at pushing a lot of zero-cost red attacks that have go again or can gain go again, and sort of prey off of the inherent power creep or power level of Channel Mount Heroic in general. Fatigue Briar doesn't do any of that. In fact, Fatigue Briar is literally playing for two specific goals. One, connect with an attack action card on your turn so that you may create an Embodiment of Earth token. And two, turn all of your 3-block non-attack action cards into 4-block non-attack action cards, thus turning them basically all into Sink Belows, and in that respect, zero-cost 4-block cards, and being far more efficient in doing so than your opponent. And why is this even functional, or why is this even good in this meta? Well, look at what this meta is full of. Lexi. Lexi is an on-hit deck that wants to push 4 damage, 5 damage, terrifying on-hits that can either give them more cards for next turn and string together another 5-card or 6-card hand, or give you things like Bloodrot Pox or Hamstring Shot or a second card in their arsenal, so on and so forth. And if you're playing into a meta that is full of these on-hit type effects, especially when Lexi is deemed by many to be the best deck, how can you counter that? Well, you can start by connecting with one of your own attacks and making an Embodiment of Earth token. And in doing so, you've turned a 3-block non-attack action card, of which we are going to fill the deck with, into a 4-block card, thus covering up 0 for 4 arrows if they are not buffed. And then on the 0 for 5s or the 1 for 5 arrows that are kind of pushed in power level, we can add in the inherent brokenness of Crown of Seeds. Yes, this deck is basically just trying to be as efficient as you possibly can be. It's basically just Oldhim. And it's very easy to look at this archetype and go, well, it is of course going to be pushed out of the way in favor of something that is just more efficient than it in Oldhim. And once Oldhim leaves, the onus is on the player base to go back and see if that exists and if that is functional and viable in the format. So I sat down to do exactly that. And I built a very heavy control version of this deck. Now, I'm going to share that list with you in a little bit, but that's not exactly the way that this list turned out from Charles Dunn, and I want to highlight a few things that I think he did a fantastic job of leaning into. So first things first, this deck is looking to do one of two things on any given turn. Be incredibly efficient off of the back of blocking with buffed up non-attack action cards, thanks to an Embodiment of Earth token, or creating an Embodiment of Earth token. Now, of course, you can do other things as well, but essentially the goal here is to play sort of breakpoint attacks. Don't have to necessarily play a bunch of them like you would with normal Briar, but you're going to be playing some number of breakpoint attacks like we see here on the very first turn in order to create, and that is a crazy little blur, in order to create Embodiment of Earth tokens. So we send a 7 attack breakpoint attack so that we can create that Embodiment of Earth, and now all of a sudden we have, first of all, filled our deck with things like Sift that block for 3. They are non-attacks. Come to Fight, as you can see, they block for 3. They pitch for blue, non-attacks. We now have the capability of throwing those out as pseudo defense reactions almost, 0 for 4s, things like Sink Below and Fate Foreseen that do so much work into so many different matchups. Now we have the capability of doing that into a deck that essentially is only going to be throwing 0 for 4s or 1 for 5s at us. And because we have created an Embodiment of Earth token, it is very easy to 1-card block this deck completely. And that is the game plan and the power level of really this deck into the variety of the meta. It's not just that this performs well into Lexi, it's that this deck can really just do this against almost everyone. Now the question, of course, then becomes how does this play into Wizard, and that is where things get a little different, but really not too terribly much, because you have a lot of blues in this deck that you may not have into others. Now, another thing that this deck does quite well, or depending on how you build it, can do quite well, is recur pieces into your deck. So for example, in the hand of Charles Dunn right now, he has access to Evergreen. Evergreen is a card that, of course, if you're running the red, is a breakpoint attack for 7, but if you're playing it from the arsenal, it goes to the bottom of your deck. Now, the version of this deck that I have been playing a ton of actually uses fused Rites of Replenishment to achieve this same thing, and in fact, it actually allows you to recur even more cards from your graveyard to your deck, but in a lot of cases, you actually don't necessarily need that much recursion. It just depends on if you're expecting to see, you know, these big fatigue style decks in the form of maybe a, you know, like a Bravo, or, you know, someone that is running remembrances, like we've actually seen in one of the top 8 matches, a Lexi running in some remembrances to try and kind of keep the parity, if you will. Now, one way this list that Charles played differs from the one that I've been playing for a long time is that he included and really leaned heavily into even more breakpoint attacks. And we can see this on screen right here. We have Scar for a Scar coming across with 4 with Go Again at lower life total in the end of the semifinals game. And this turn and this play is just so incredibly powerful because it allowed him to push a breakpoint and try to gain that embodiment, and also push lethal, of course, at the end game. So that gets covered up completely, and he's able to follow this up from the arsenal and from the hand, pitching a blue, playing an Evergreen from arsenal for 7. And this essentially all but guarantees that you are going to have an embodiment of Earth token on your turn, so that when you draw up, if you draw onto cards like Sift, or you draw into any other 3 blocks, they become 4 block cards if they are non-attacks, and that is incredibly potent. And as you can see, it puts everyone in a sticky situation, and in this case, it forces Craig to just straight up block and pass. And yes, you don't gain the embodiment of Earth token on Charles's side, but you also took every card out of their hand, and now you're sitting on a 4-card hand that can block reasonably well, and has the ability to play Fate Foreseen and things of that nature. But this is the power that we have access to in this scenario. That's a 3-arrow turn that is completely blocked out with the hand off of the back of very efficient 0 for 4 blocks, essentially, and Crown of Seeds being used as a prevention effect and a cycling effect. It just stymies 3-arrow turns, and it really requires your opponent to set up power turns like they would against Oldhim. And why is that really good in this meta? Well, everyone has already taken everything out of their decks that was good into those Oldhim fatigue matchups. Like, people are no longer citing in these massive packages just to be able to set up alpha strike turns, if you will, against Oldhim players, because he doesn't exist in the format anymore. And instead, now we have a Briar that can basically do the same thing, but a little bit more fun and a little fairer, in my opinion. So let me show you a breakdown of the version of the deck that I have been playing. So this is the version of the deck that, like I said, I have been playing for about a month. This is the 3rd copy of this deck. I like to create the deck, and I haven't been using the latest version feature as much on February until recently, but I created this deck a little over a month ago, and if we look at the results of this deck, looks like, yeah, all the way back in 728, this version of the deck is when I started playing this copy of it before, or after making a few changes, but I've been playing this deck well, pretty consistently across the board, plus or minus. I took about a week off playing some Dromai stuff and some Kano stuff as well. But at this version of the deck, this, like I said, is the 3rd version. I've put 29 matches into with a 79% win rate. Take it for what you will. It is Talishar after all. I know some people don't prefer Talishar as much, but this version of the deck has very much performed overall, and a couple of these losses were really me just changing some cards and then not realizing I changed those and just straight up messing up sometimes. And I'm sure a better player can take this to the pinnacle of Flesh and Blood. Now, how this list differs from several of the lists that have already been out there, let's talk about it. So again, the fundamentals of this deck is that we are going to play above rate attacks that push a breakpoint or just threaten a very scary hit. And then we're going to play just a buku load of very efficient blocking cards. And so if we shift this to subtypes, these are our attacks. We have 28 attacks, and of those attacks, we have many that push breakpoints. Really, Autumn's Touch in this list, Raging Onslaught, Runic Reclamations are our pushing breakpoint attacks. I very much like the Rites of Replenishment, but I'll tell you right now, this list differs in that sense from several of the other top 8 lists that have made their rounds, including the, of course, first place national championship, Charles Dunn. I do not believe he ran Rites of Replenishment, and instead he had Evergreens in here. Nevertheless, the point is that we can use these types of attacks to push this 7 breakpoint. And if we're up against a hero that doesn't really want to block that out with like 2 cards plus a piece of equipment, we get an Embodiment of Earth token. And why is that good? Well, it's good because all of these non-attack action cards, except for Earthlore Surge, all of them block for 3. Well, technically Anthem of Spring, by the way, this blocks for 3. It literally you always block with it plus another card, and so it creates its own Embodiment of Earth token, which gives you this going up from 2 to 3. And this card is absolutely insane, by the way. This card's nuts in this deck. It was part of the reason why I wanted to build this deck over a month ago. In the first place, well, yeah, I guess over a month ago. So the nice thing about all of these is that they all become 0 for 4s, including Burdens of the Past, which is a sideboard card. But they essentially become these beautiful blocking cards that work perfectly alongside of your Fate for Scenes and your Sink Belows, and technically your Unmovables as well, of which I'm only running the blues. Really interesting kind of things that you can glean from how this deck functions is really how you plan on leveraging Crown of Seeds. Now, the reason I started building this deck over a month ago, and in a lot of cases the reasons why many people are playing this deck now, is because this card is super good. It's super busted, and it currently can't be played in Classic Constructed once Briar officially gets the word that she rides off into the sunset. I think it's like September 14th or something like that. Because both Earth heroes are officially in Living Legend format. Why is this card so good? It gives you a card replacing itself when you pitch for it, or if you use this off of the Tunic resource, it basically just gives you a card. You lose the arsenal, it goes to the bottom of the deck, you gain a card in hand, which in a lot of cases gives you a blocking card. It protects you for 1, and it lets you float resources. And how can we use the floating resources? If we pitch a blue, I don't know, let's just say we pitch Anthem of Spring here, to Crown of Seeds, we draw a card, and then we have 2 floating resources, of which we can spend on Oasis Respite, paying 1 to stop 4 and gain a life, and Brothers in Arms, of which we can turn into a 4 blocking card. And this is the crux of the deck. It wants to play defensively first. It wants to run you out of threats, and it has the capability of doing that against literally any deck in the format. How do I know? Well, I've done it. This deck can actually just go toe-to-toe as far as fatigue is concerned with every deck in the format. And it's simply because we have the ability to recur cards. And I do it with Rites of Replenishment, but it's just as easy, and in fact sometimes easier, depending on how your arsenal goes, to do it with Evergreen. And this is what we've seen most of the decks, well, I should say the 2 decks that have either top-8'd or won with this archetype doing, is recurring things, or recurring specifically Evergreen itself, because if you play it at a breakpoint from your arsenal, it goes to the bottom of your deck when the combat chain closes. And that is incredibly powerful. Even if you don't do that, though, you can just play this really strong blocking game, and you can force your opponent to play into it by trying to vault over your attacks and your defenses. As far as the equipment suite is concerned, of course, we're running Crown of Seeds. Fyendal Spring Tunic is a must because we tunic into Crown to get that maximum value. Grasp of the Arknight is absolutely beautiful because off of a blue, you can pitch to Grasp and create a rune chant, and then you can Reaping Blade for 1. Now, there is a bit of a debate, in my opinion, with Reaping Blade versus Dread Scythe. The majority of the games that I've played with this deck, I have actually just straight up played Dread Scythe. Yes, you have to have a blue for it, but I recently added more reds to this list than I had before. And so when you have a lot of blues in the list, you can oftentimes just keep a blue, and that's totally fine. Why do I choose this one over? Well, I can conditionally turn off my opponent's life gain, but in this meta, that doesn't really matter as much. What matters is I like running Sigil of Solace, and if you're playing Reaping Blade and you have more health, which is fairly regularly, you can't actually gain any life off of Sigil. So it ends up becoming this strange little second cycle card that wins you games in a lot of respects, but you have to play it in a very crafty way. Now, if you place Dread Scythe, this can just become a gain 3 with impunity. And that is oftentimes how I've used it in Dromai, and it also is how it functions in this deck if you're playing Dread Scythe. But on Reaping Blade, you have to dance around it a little bit more. And of course, Spellbound Creepers is literally a block 1, and I don't use it for anything besides that in this deck. I generally run this main core of 50 cards, and then I side in Fate for Scenes, Oasis Respite, Sigil of Suffering, Sigil of Solace, Sink Belows. If I choose, I can go for all of those. Blue Unmovables for decks that go kind of tall in general, but you can basically side in any number of these defensive pieces to supplement this 50 card core. And oftentimes I will definitely run more than 50 cards because it just is really easy to throw these in. But you can also, if you want to, in a specific matchups where you really want to find exactly these types of cards, just side in exactly 50 so that you can find these quickly. This was easily piloted around by a pilot of the skill caliber, especially in the control side of things, of Charles Dunn, who, if you don't know, was an avid, if memory serves correctly, I do believe, was an avid Oldham player and very, very skilled at playing the control game. And this was just a slam dunk pick for him into this meta and into this overall tournament. And I don't think anyone gave this the respect it deserves. And I deeply, deeply wish that I could have commentated along with my friends on this US National Championship, because like I said, I believed so strongly in this deck that I had been practicing it and only telling very few people about how this deck has performed for me over the past month plus, because I planned on playing this deck in the Calling Dallas-Fort Worth, and now I can't do that, and that's okay, because at least someone got to show off how good this deck actually is. I had multiple people tell me that this deck was a little bit inconsistent, a little bit of a meme, and I couldn't buy it. I couldn't buy it because it had just done so much good work for me in a variety of ways. I built it that I just knew that it had legs, and it was so exciting to watch Charles not only take the win with it, but push Briar into Living Legend status off of the back of a deck that does not run Rosetta Thorn. So congratulations to him. This is how the deck functions. If you have time before she officially LLs and you want to take her out for a spin, I will leave the link in the description down below. Of course, patrons, you have access to this link and any changes that I've made or will make on the Patreon. So if you want access to that and this deck, feel free to check that link in the description. And let me know what you think about this win and how you think the meta will change as she LLs, and perhaps Lexi, because Lexi picked up a lot of wins, even though it wasn't a US Nats win. Lexi picked up a lot of wins this weekend as well. It means the world to me that you've all chosen to join in this, so thank you so much for watching. As always, we'll see you next time.